Built over 100 guitars, 129 guitars on Carmine Street and Bond Street. He eventually moved to Bond Street. His apprentice was a guy by the name of Lucian Barnes. And Lucian took over the shop on Carmine Street. During that time, I was getting involved in the guitar workshop in Roslyn, Long Island, 200 Forest Street, who the director was Ken Seiden. And it was the first accredited guitar school in New York State. And he was a pretty wild guy. He liked his alcohol, and every night he'd go to sleep with a cigarette in his chest after drinking half a bottle of gin. But he was a Zen macrobiotic diet. So a funny story is, while working there, for the time I worked there before it burned down, Ken fell asleep, and every once in a while there'd be a cigarette burned down his chest. He burned the place down one night, and I come to work, and he's playing his Velasquez guitar in the lawn, half naked, with the strings, part of the strings melted off the guitar. And he says, listen to it, it must have aged 20 years. Ken Seiden. While working at the guitar workshop, I spent a lot of time in the village. My first visit was when I first got there, before actually moving there, was with Izzy Young, and this was the tail end of the beatnik generation. Izzy would have these sessions at the Folklore Center on 6th Avenue, where there would be poetry and bongo drums in the background. The beginning of rap music, what can I say? So Izzy was pretty much involved in the whole movement at the beginning, and this was the early 60s. So we're now in the 60s. Rubio was building guitars, Manuk Papazian was building guitars, these were the hand builders. There was very, very little information regarding building guitars. Most of the guitar makers that existed, the hand builders that existed, or the companies, did not share information. This was something, was a taboo. And so that was basically the beginning with folk music as well. It started in the 50s, the end of the 50s. It was the end of the beat generation and big bands. And folk music started pulling in. I got to meet some of the early people: Mississippi John Hurt, Dave Van Ronk. I can go down the whole list. I don't need to be crazy about it, but these were all people who were customers of mine and became friends. For me, moving into the village, I took over Lucian Barnes' shop, which was Jose Rubio's, and Juan Salstre's prior to that. And at that time, when I took over the shop, I bought into the shop. You have to buy into the space. $500, that was all I had on the planet, other than 3 cents, which I bought a roll with. Lucian and Gene Clark were getting ready to move to California. So they needed money, and the three of us built instruments for a month and shared some information. Not a lot, but it was good. It was different techniques and so on. And this was all classical guitars. This was all classical guitars. Well, after they left, I figured, I got to figure out how to sell these damn things. So I met Vladimir Bobury, Leonard Bolatine, and Suzanne Block. One was at Manor School, one was the head of the Classical Guitar Society, and one was at Juilliard. Suzanne Block was the lute player. And it was an interesting beginning because it became my marketing strategy for selling my instruments. In any case, this went on for a few years. I got to keep going faster because there's a lot to cover. I had the shop on Carmine Street till about 1966, and I got my first apprentice, David Santo, and we eventually became partners. We were sponsored by Danny Mary of La Bella String Company, and eventually we moved to 100 Grand Street, and I wound up in 100 Grand Street with a lot of guitar makers who trained under me. Michael Millard, Bill Compiano, quite a few others. Walter Lipton, trying to think of all the people. They're all gone. Other than Michael Millard, he's still here. Tom Humphrey. In any case, that shop became the focal point, and that's where we started building steel string guitars on a more formidable basis. And that was got me started. The person who got me started building steel strings was my good friend of the Loving Spoonful,
John
Sebastian. Yeah. On the block on Carmine Street, we had flamenco guitar players, we had classical guitar players, we had steel string guitar players. I even had the Mothers of Invention on Carmine Street. It was a funny block. The Italians ran it, and they never allowed head shops. If there was a head shop that came in and said, "The hell with you," they blew it up. Yeah. It was very simple. When the city came in and started putting meters on the block, they went around every night with a pipe cutter. So by the time they made an agreement with the city, the meters were down to that height. It was a little community. That was the musicians and the writers. Shel Silverstein was down on the east side. He became a friend. And to support some of my work, I took a job at the Cafe Figaro as the night manager, which was very famous on Bleecker and McDougal. And there I got to meet some amazing people, musicians, artists, writers, and a lot of them just starting off broke. And so I'd feed them hamburgers for free and good espresso. But they always got together there and so on, and that was one of the focal points. The other one was Max's Kansas City, where all the arts people got involved in. Andy Warhol, the Theater of the Absurd, the New York Dance Company, and so on. During this time, I met Gilles Laurent, who eventually became a very well-known photographer. He did all the artists and so on. And I did a lot of kinetic sculpture with him over the years. We were fortunate enough to be picked in Soho as one of the 10 downtown for 1 year. And we were always pulling off some pretty crazy pranks. And the 10 downtown, we did two sculptures, one of which I did and one of which Gilles did. Gilles did 2 giant balloons, just a long thing, side by side, and oiled them. And you can come up to the loft and view the loft and look at the artwork. But one way, you'd have to pay them $10, and the other way, you had to take all your clothes off and walk in between the two balloons, which are side by side and oiled. So we had more than you can imagine go through those balloons. And at the end of the balloons, I built a membrane which was sound sensitive, and in the middle of the membrane was a light facing this membrane with red aniline dye. And so they'd get up on this platform and the thing would go boom, boom, and these aniline dust would go up in the air and spread its wings, and they all got dyed red. And then they went into the showers, and that finished it all off. They went dyed. And so for a week after this whole thing, you can always tell the people that went through our loft because they had red nails, red skin. It was great. In any case, that was the village in the 60s with hope and want to make things better in the future. The folk music, well, you had the Clearwater, you had the Allen Block Sandal Shop where all the folk musicians would get together besides the folklore center, and every Sunday get together and play music. Well, during this time, there weren't that many people repairing instruments and so on, and so I was building guitars, and that was it. And then I got involved with a guy by the name of Carl Friedrich Harshoff III. He was an unbelievable musician. He didn't want to be in the limelight. He was as good, or if not better, than Julian Bream and Segovia. He was just unbelievable. Could play anything. He could pick up an instrument in 30 days, he'd be concert status. He's disgusting. Just made me crazy. You know, here I'm struggling to play this damn instrument, and he just picks it up and starts playing. In any case, we did a couple of tours together. I did a lecture series with him about the lute. But I'm jumping ahead, so let me go back. So in my shop on Carmine Street, a junkie comes in and wants to sell this box load of oud parts, $5. So I buy the box load of oud parts and put it together. What does this do? I finish the thing, I learn how to play some of it, and I'm sitting on the stoop of my shop on Carmine Street, and who walks by a fellow Armenian, Chik Ganemian, an unbelievable oud player. He looks at the oud and he says, "My father's oud. Where'd you get it?" So what do? I handed it to him. So the next day he comes back and brings another oud for me to play, a Caribbean, which is a wonderful, wonderful oud. And that was the beginning of my building of ouds and lutes. I wound up in Carmine Street building 150 guitars and 75 lutes. Theorbo lutes, ouds, Baroque lutes, Elizabethan lutes, Renaissance lutes, and so on. But it also allowed me to learn about other instruments, which was a major contribution to building guitars, because they all had logic and they could all be applied to the instrument. I repaired canoons, doumbeks, bouzouki. I told this one story in my book, but I got to repeat it because it's pretty amazing about customers. and what you wind up with. A Greek bouzouki player, and I spent a lot of time up in the Mediterranean district. But this Greek bouzouki player comes into my shop. He's talking Greek to his wife. His wife on one hand, is bouzouki on the other. And we're negotiating a fret job, and he has to have it done by the next day because he's playing. So he's bartering with me, which is very typical of Eastern people. And I repaired the instrument, I refret it, straightened out the neck and everything. And he comes back the next day. Now, I was asking $75 for a fret job at that time. And he cheaped me down to 50. But he comes in the next day, pulls out, now understand, in the Greek area, they carry these giant knives, folded up knives that look like a razor blade, but bigger, right? And they keep it in their pocket. So he comes in the next day, he picks up the bouzouki, he tunes it and goes, you know, just goes through every fret, everything in 32 seconds, you know. And then he still hasn't cracked a smile. I'm saying, uh-oh. He reaches into his pocket that way, under his jacket, and I say, uh-oh, I'm getting to get sliced. And I jumped the gun again, because in that pocket, he had a little aspirin tin with his bouzouki picks. Then he played. Okay, so after that, he reaches into this side. That's the razor. Wasn't. He pulls out a wad of bills and throws it up in the air, grabs his wife in one hand, grabs his bouzouki in the other hand, and goes down, dancing out into Carmine Street. It's not the end of the story. I used to go up to the Mediterranean district with Chick and Eamon. We used to hang out and play music in a place called the Egyptian Garden. But this particular night, we went to this place because I heard he was playing bouzouki. So we go into this place. He's up on the stage, belly dancers going at it, and he recognizes me. He stops the music right in the middle. He went, what's going on? And he points to me. I said, oh, here comes the razor blade. And he says, in perfect English, that was the man who saved my life. Drinks for everyone in the house. I mean, he must have bought 100 drinks that night. So there is something about what you are doing as guitar makers or players that's really wonderful. So in any case, a little quick story. I can tell you some bad stories too. Felipe Gallo, a flamenco guitar player, came into my shop. He spent a whole month. He ordered a guitar from me. He wanted a classical flamenco guitar. He ordered a guitar from me, and every day he'd come in, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? What about changing this and that? Whole month, 30 days. I finished the guitar in the white. I always used to finish the guitars in the white and then do the final adjustments. And he plays it and he loves it. I said, good, I'm gonna finish it now. Go away. So, I'm raising the grain on the top with damp cloth. And I used to candle these tops. So, looking for resin marks and stuff like that, or imperfections, but I didn't pick this one up because it was a blister. So I wet it down a little, and this blister pops up. And I'm saying, oh, shit. Not repairable, at least to do it right. And he walks through the door. And he says, what do you think about us doing before you do? I said, you're right. I grabbed the guitar by the neck, wham, right over the vise. He went like this. I walked out the shop as the splinters were coming down off the ceiling. So you got two different stories, but I built another guitar the next month, and the good thing was he never showed up once while I built it. We moved to Grand Street, and that's when, after Sebastian got me going with steel string guitars, we built a whole variety of instruments, classical guitars, size 1 or single or size steel strings. And then I said, oh, I think I want to start building a medium-sized guitar, and that was a size 3 and so on. And during that time, we had customers like Josh White come up, Jr., Bob Dylan. That's another story. Bob Dylan, he came up, and he was a customer of mine on Carmine Street. He had me fix his harmonium first, and he ordered a guitar as well. But he's walking through the shop, and in the back room we had the bending presses and stuff like that. And one of the guys had been thrown out of his apartment, and he didn't know what to do with his pet iguana. So he had it hanging out on a shelf, just hanging out. The damn thing wouldn't move. We'd feed him hamburger meat and everything else. And Bob walks over to the shelf, and he looks at, look at that iguana, you know, don't look. He got his finger bit by the iguana. It was very embarrassing, to say the least. But that shop was a shop where many went through. I had Roger Sadowski come in. He wanted a job. I offered him $35 a week, and he says, I'm not taking it. He went to work for Augie LaPrinzi. At that point, Augie LaPrinzi Guitars was in business. And it started building. This was the beginning. Bob Taylor came as well at that time. Before me was Mossman Guitars. I'm trying to remember all of this stuff. There's a lot of information, so forgive me if I'm missing it. In any case, where was I? I was the train. Hang on. So we built, I don't know how many hundreds of guitars in Grand Street. And then we moved the shop. The shop was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We had a lot of orders. So I decided to move the company to New Hampshire after writing letters to the different states that I thought about going to. And New Hampshire gave me the best deal. I bought the Granite State Mower Company, 35,000 foot building. Guess for how much? $5,500. It was amazing. I mean, I looked at other buildings, but this place had character. It had, still had the original water turbine down below with all the porta potties alongside of it for relieving yourself. Had the jack shafts on the ceiling for the machinery. And it was a perfect place for me. I like funky stuff. And we started building guitars there. And at that point, I got involved in supplying woods. I met in the 60s, going back to the 60s, I met a guy by the name of Bill Lewis. And prior to Bill, there was only a few companies supplying materials. H.L. Wild on the Lower East Side, Metropolitan Music Company on Park Avenue South, 222 Park Avenue South, International Violin Company in Baltimore. And there were other companies like J.H. Monteith and William Marshall. Those were bigger companies. And Dahl Lumber, who had a veneer saw, which was cutting a lot of the Monteith and Dahl Company had the 2-segment saws that cut veneer available. And that's where all the Brazilian rosewood came from before they put an embargo on the logs. The Brazilians figured out, and so did everyone else in the world, that if we sold the logs, we couldn't make money on sawing them. So that was that deal. Okay, going back. J.H. Monteith. See, I jumped back and now I gotta go forward. That's bad. Where was I?
In New Hampshire.
Oh, New Hampshire, okay.
Where in New Hampshire?
The first place was Hinsdale, New Hampshire. And that was where the Granite State Mower Company was. We built a lot of guitars there, and then I got involved with Bill Lewis because he introduced me to cedar. And I started cutting cedar and buying blocks and making guitar tops with cedar because I really liked it for classical guitars. And eventually, Bill opened up the Bill Lewis Music mail order company, and eventually that was sold to Ruthie's Mercantile, Todd Taggart. Okay, and I said, well, maybe I'll do a mail order company as well. So that was the first thing I did. And I was cutting a lot of spruce for Martin guitars at that time, for Ovation guitars, for other companies. I used to come out here quite a bit and buy logs, or buy cants, or buy lumber, whatever I could get my hands on. That was good quality spruce. And also buy cedar and block it and cut it. I eventually set up a sawmill in New Hampshire in West Swansea, which had 2 major resaws and a head rig. The head rig was the second Stellite head rig in the United States. Martin had the first. Their head rig was a breakdown mill, which was very slow. My head rig was very fast, and we wound up cutting about 15 million feet of wood a year. Not all instrument wood. Local oak, knotty pine, and hemlock. The oak we cut quite a bit, went to Germany, to Theater Nagel, and so on, in berms, where we cut the whole log, strap it together and ship it off. And the resaws we had a Bolter resaw, which I had to deal with all the loggers who cut firewood. And I said, if you give me a truck load of just maple, that's all I want. I wound up selling maple to pool cues to Japan, a container a month of pool sticks, all rock made. In any case, at that time, Bob Taylor started really taking off, and one of the few people that was willing to share information, other than me as well. And people would call me up and ask me about things, I'd tell them what to do, if I knew, or I'd tell them to go somewhere, one way or the other. But it was a beginning. There were books coming out about, and information about how to build instruments, what they were all about. And that was wonderful, because when I started, I had to go to the library and go through all old kind of transcripts and stuff like that. That's how I learned how to build lutes. Guitar, they had basically one book called the Shearer book. It's a little blue book about this big, told you how to build a guitar. There was no information available. Today, everywhere you look, there's guitars, guitar books. One of my people, Bill Campiano, wrote a book. John Nadelson and Bill Campiano. I can go down a whole list. And that's when it started taking off between the guitar schools, Roberto Venn, and so on. Brian Gallup. I can go down a whole list of schools. And what you have now is a lot of boutique builders and people, home hobbyists, because they can get the wood, they can get the information. And it's a whole different world today. The folk scene evolved as everything. And now we have not only folk music, but rock and roll was started in the late 50s, but evolved into everything, every kind of music available. And you're all part of it. And that's my half hour. That's what I'm supposed to talk for. I will open the floor up to questions if you have questions. Very quiet.
I do.
Uh-oh. Steve?
Michael, how long did you build guitars in New Hampshire, and what was your production there? How many people did you have working, and what was the organization like?
Well-
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that was between the sawmill, the logging crews, the mail order company, the guitar company, 135. And it was great. I mean, again, the sawmill was on 11 acres, and then eventually Granite State Mower Company burned down in '79. And I didn't want to resurrect the guitar company at that point because I saw a recession coming, a major recession coming. But my wife at the time kept saying, look out there, they're all rummaging through the wreckage, the ashes, to recover whatever there is to recover. And I softened up. I said, we should run just the sawmills and mail order. No, you gotta do guitars. So I made a deal with a company. I got another loan. At that point I was loan free, but I got a loan and built a 22,000 square foot facility on the property in West Swansea. So everything was moved over to West Swansea. And that was in 1982 is when I closed it, because the recession wiped me out. Couldn't carry it all. And at that point, I started doing a lot of consulting work. I worked for Giannini, George Loudon, did a lot of, set up George's first factory. And Giannini, that place was something else. I don't know whether you've ever been out there, Steve. He was building 5,000 guitars a month in this factory. Also electronics, lamps, you name it. And of the 5,000 guitars, when I walked through, I couldn't find one that was perfect. Couldn't find, they all had something wrong with them. Drove me crazy. So I wrote a whole report to him, 3 different ways to make it better. And he wanted me to take over running the company. I said, no thanks. But it was an eye-opener. George, on the other hand, was very, very smart. George Loudon, great guitar, wonderful guitar, and a wonderful person to be with. Good snooker player too. Yeah.
So, in your early days making classical guitars, what did you use as models?
as a model. Okay, well, I built my first guitar. And it was modeled after a worker who was with Manuel Velasquez, Victor Manuel Pinheiro. And I copied that guitar. And I hate to tell you, I was in a studio out Long Island. I bent my first set of sides on a tin can and a Bernzomatic torch. I glued it together with bricks and rubber bands, because I didn't have any money for clamps and stuff. I had a funky chisel and a plane, and I built my first guitar. And it was a real education, and it sounded great. And that's when I met Carl Hershaw, who was good friends with Ken Sargent. And he played it, and he says, it's a good sounding instrument. And he gave me the inspiration to go further. And then I said, well, I better look into how to do woodworking and stuff like that. I didn't know anything. But I wound up building 15 guitars, trashed the next 14. I kept the first one, I still have it, and it's still together. It's amazing. But the next 14 I trashed. I built them and smashed them. And then number 16, which I started as number 1, I became a professional builder.
What about Eugene Clark? Eugene Clark.
Gene,
Yeah.
great builder, amazing builder. He really knew his shit. And he also was of the old school. He knew how to plane sets, you know, because we did, with all of all those instruments that we built, there were no power tools. I got lucky because next to me in my shop was John Tripodi, who was a cabinet maker, so I'd use his table saw once in a while. But that would be it. And everything Gene did was by hand, as well as I and Lucian. Everything was by hand. And when you do something by hand as a guitar maker, you begin to feel the wood. It becomes the soul, your soul. You inherently know it in your head and in your heart what has to be done. Sometimes they ask you, I get asked information, I can't tell them because it's all there. It's just done automatically. You know, when you build that many instruments by hand, that's what happens. So, yeah.
Can you share a little bit about the move out to Seattle?
In Seattle, no. I moved to Seattle, and that's when I became, after I closed the company in '82, besides doing consulting work, I started making bridge pins and stuff like that. And started supplying inlays and strips, wood strips, and that became my profession, and it became Gurian Instruments, which is still in existence now with an employee of mine who took over, Kevin Almeida, and I think he probably supplies some of the people here. That was in Pioneer Square, is where I moved originally. And then Paul Allen decided to upgrade the whole area. And that was the end of me. I was renting from the University of Washington, and for some reason they wanted me out. So I had to move. They gave me a month to move my equipment. And I said, whoa, okay, that was at the .com era, and everyone, the whole city was buzzing, Seattle. So I went around looking for a building, looking to rent, nothing available. When a building would come up for sale, it'd be sold by 12 o'clock. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the buildings I looked at, you could see, they had see-through walls, so you could see your neighbor. So I said, what am I gonna do? I used to love going to the aquarium. I grew up on the water at home as a kid. I said, I'm gonna buy a barge. And there were reasons why I bought the barge. One is no taxes. The rentals were cheap. If I had 10,000 square feet on the barge. It was a big barge. It was 120 feet by 40 feet, 3 stories. And my rent was $2,000 a month. If I had 10,000 feet in Seattle today, what are we talking about, right? And I was in Ballard in a secure marina. Originally I was in North Lake Union, and then I moved to Ballard. And that's where we supplied the whole industry with decorative wood inlay and so on, all your needs at this point. We got to be friends with a lot of different companies. I could tell you some stories. This guy over here could tell you probably more better stories, Steve. But I spent a lot of time with a lot of companies, with Martin Guitars. I built the first powerful electric bending presses with Metropolitan Music, who was making violin pegs at the time. I built his machinery to contour and polish the pegs after they came out of a centerless grinder. I built a lot of equipment for different people, and it was a lot of fun doing it because you meet some wonderful people. Ovation, I was never enamored of the instrument. My friend Matty didn't particularly like some of the people at Ovation. Originally, the guy by the name of Jim Gurley, who came into my shop one day with an Ovation guitar, took it out of the case and smashed it against the wall. And he said, look at that. It doesn't break. I said, yeah. Eventually, I met the Kamans. Bill Kaman ran the guitar facility. And I used to pull some real good ones on them. One of which was at NAMM. NAMM is the National Association of Musical Instruments. One year, there was an Israeli company copying Ovations. So we were out to lunch one day, Everett Porter and Bill Kaman and a couple of others. And I said, were you at the show? And he says, yeah. I said, did you go walk around and you see the Israeli instrument? No, what about it? It's exact replica, everything. The rosettes, the headstock, everything. And you know what they call it? The Ovation. They didn't talk to me for 2 weeks. But in any case, the evolution kept getting more and more so with private builders at the big music shows and the smaller music show. Woodstock came, Healdsburg came, Lucas Mercantile did a great show. Now we have Old Town School of Music. What do we have? We have Harrisburg still? The one on the West Coast. Yes, one on the West Coast. Which one is that, Steve, you know? All right, there's many shows which are available, which you can show in, and so on. Yes?
I have a question. There's a skills center near where I work, a skills center where they
I can't hear you.
You can build stuff at a skills center near where I work. They build, they do like welding and CNC and all this stuff, right? So the instructor asked me, he said, what's the difference if I can make a guitar with CNC just as well as the person that can make it by hand?
Okay.
And, I had my own thoughts, but from somebody like you, I wonder what your opinion of that question is.
Well, we had a lot of automated equipment, but hand building is a whole different world than production building. And a lot of the hand builders sometimes farm out things like getting their neck carved, or getting bridges, or parts. And then assembling. Today, there's a lot of CNC. At Gurian Instruments, we used CNC. We had 3 working lasers, and we had 2 turning centers, and there's a place for it. But if you really want to be involved in guitar making, you have to start with feeling the wood and feeling how it goes together. Yeah.
Do you have any insight into voicing instruments? Do you have any insight into voicing instruments?
Voicing instruments, that's the intuitive part. That's knowing what you want out of the instrument, and it starts from when you're building the instrument. For instance, you want a fast responsive instrument, you don't build it as deep. At least that's what I found. And voicing, that's why I did it in the white. At the end, I did all the control, final tuning and everything else was after the guitar was together. While building it and bracing it, I did certain things, tap tuning and stuff like that. But at the end, the final adjustments came inside and, believe it or not, on the outside of the top. And I did it 3 ways, basically.
Were you doing that mostly by ear at that point?
Yeah, when I had ears.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?